Forgive our sins as we try to walk. Pray, Father, that we will change who we are. We'll be more like your Son. We'll take up on the characteristics created. That our lives might be pleasing in your sight. Pray, Father, you'll help us when we stumble. You'll pick us up. Pray, Father, that you bless the church the world over. Them as faces difficulties and struggles. And realize that the world is not where we will spend eternity. We don't want to have many ties, but desire. Pray, Father, that you help us prepare. So, I don't know, this comes to my mind, and I don't know if you've ever thought about it. But if you start talking about gospel, when would you say that the gospel? And I think most of us would, oh, the New Testament. After Jesus died on the cross, and the gospel starts being talked about. But God's plan was for all of us to have the opportunity. Yes, there was a time when the message was preached. The message couldn't have been preached about the saving blood of Jesus Christ until Jesus Christ sacrificed himself upon the cross. I understand that, but the gospel itself is something that God has had in his mind since before the world began. When we talk about verses today, we're going to see about foreordation. That's a good word or not. Being foreordained to do something. How God had it in his mind. And when we think about the gospel, we need to think of it in terms that God has been planning for this for a long time. And so now, this out as Paul, all the graces that he's addressing in Rome, he's addressing this significance. He's addressing the past. He's addressing the immorality that is there from the Gentile nation, the ungodliness or unbelief of the Jews who were hard in their traditions of the law of Moses and had misused it in many ways. And so now he's talking in chapter 8. We've talked about it's such a great thing, the transition that's taken place such that we can get away from the law of Moses and the law of the inward man, the fleshly man, and that we can live spiritual lives. Not that we don't have fleshly desires still within us, and there's a fleshly man there that still has wants and desires, but the suppression of him because of the Spirit of God that's in us. And that we have to change. That there's a death that took place. And that death means that we put away that old man. And we develop a new man. And that new man is continually growing and becoming more and more like God. That's our whole purpose. Once we become a child of God, is to grow closer and become more like Jesus and all of our attributes. And that's easier said than done, obviously, but it's where we're headed. Now he points out in verse 17 that if we obey the gospel, that we become heirs with Christ. But notice what he says in verse 17 in the latter part. We'll just start at verse 17. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. And so he's going to talk now through the end of the chapter, the idea of being saved by the gospel, being in a position now that we've been cleansed by the blood of Jesus Christ, that we're no longer living under the law of Moses, law of flesh, that we now have transitioned to the gospel, and that we're heirs according to the promise. We're children of God. And if we're children of God, then he's going to let us know as we go through the rest of the chapter that it was never said that the gospel is going to make life easy. It was never said that it's going to be tranquil from the standpoint that our environment's going to change. And so as we look at the early church, we see difficulty. The Christians were certainly persecuted, Saul having a big part of that. Now Paul, who writes the Roman letter, and he's writing these things some 20-something years after the establishment of the church. It's been some time. But in that period of time, Christians have suffered persecution. And they've been scattered. And so Paul makes it clear that if we've accepted the teachings of the gospel, if we have changed who we are, that we're not going to escape suffering. It's going to be part of the Christian life. And we're going to be heirs with him and joint heirs if indeed we suffer with him. And then he says, "For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to compare with the glory which shall be revealed in us." And we're going to see the progression of the gospel and how we came out of sin and what God did in that process and how ultimately we're going to be glorified. And that's the process of what the gospel does to us. As we come to a knowledge of it, as we are obedient to it, to the call of the gospel, and we see that terminology here, and we've seen it in other places that we're called. And that calling is not somebody putting a thought in your head and you're saying, well, I'm just sort of feel compelled to do this. Somebody's called me. Well, the gospel calls us through the teaching of the word. That's how we develop our faith. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing because of the word of God. And so we develop that faith, and then that faith leads us to change our lives. We believe in Jesus Christ. We want to be obedient to the teachings of the gospel, and we change our lives. And as we look at that process, we're going to continue to be changed by God as we go through that process. And then ultimately, there's going to be a place of glory. Now, that doesn't mean as a Christian here, we're not going to enjoy things and we're not going to be glorified in some ways as we live upon the earth. But our ultimate glory is going to be when he comes again and takes us home. And we live in glory with him. And so if we suffer with him, then we're going to be glorified with him. And the suffering that we're going to take place in this present time, he says you can't compare it to the glory that's going to be revealed, to the glory that we're going to experience. And, you think through your lives and you may think, man, I've had a tough life. And some people do. And I've had so many things that have happened to me, and it's been very, very difficult. This life hasn't been easy. And it's that way for some. And some people don't have as much difficulty. But the point that we're making here is that if you were to have the worst things in the world to happen to you, if you could compile those some way, if you could pile them up in a stack, if you're living according to the will of God, if you've obeyed the gospel, then those trials and tribulations can in no way even compare to the glory that we're going to receive. Now that's the message that he's given to the Romans. So the comfort that he is instilling in them to understand, yes, there are difficulties in this life. We're going to suffer as a Christian. In some cases, we have had brethren that have suffered to the point of death, extremely painful deaths, because of their belief in the gospel. Now, we don't see that much today, at least in this country, but it happens throughout the world. There are people who will worship today in hiding because of fear of their lives. And yet, it's not as bad, at least in most places that we live in today, as it was back then. But we'll get some that way in a couple of things. These are things that we receive from our missionaries. Obviously, you know Barry Hatcher in Indonesia. He was here this year. We're trying to help them because where they are right now is a dominant Muslim region. And the Muslims in that area are becoming more and more into trying to persecute Christians. Now, it's pretty simple at this point. If you go to a parking place, you want to park in a place. If you're not a Muslim, you can't park here. That's not too bad. I mean, you know, you can work around that some. But that's where they're headed. They're headed to, if you aren't a Muslim, you don't belong here. And so because of the persecution, they're moving the school that he's a part of. Well, in India, we're getting the same kind of thing, persecution of Christians, those who are obeying the gospel. If you're not Hindu or some other religious affiliation that the Indians believe in, there's a lot of push to get Christianity out. And so there's persecution, but not like we've seen. But Paul's trying to get them to understand, and obviously the persecution of their time was difficult. I mean, beatings, imprisonment, death, and as we get a little bit later on, past this period of time, there's going to be even horrific deaths that are going to be suffered by Christians. And Paul's saying, whatever comes your way in terms of suffering, it can in no way be able to equate it to the glory that you're going to experience that's going to be there for us. And so, don't give up. The gospel does not mean peace and tranquility. People are not going to understand that they're going to persecute what they don't know. And that'll be a part of your lives, and you'll have to deal with that. But it's not to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the really revealing of the sons of God. Okay, what did he say? We are now, because we have been baptized, that we've obeyed the gospel, we become sons of God. And so now he says the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. People have been waiting for this. Now, we might think of it in terms of the Messiah coming, but God, in looking in his, I don't know what you want to call it, in his mind, perhaps, in the very beginning, could see this. He knew that the gospel was going to be preached. That was the means of being able to equate or bring together sinful man and righteous sacrifice of his son in such a way that he could view us as righteous and free from sin. And God knew that in the beginning. His intention was for the gospel to come, always, from the very beginning. And so, if you look at history and you look at, obviously when people were living in Old Testament times, we see them live their lives, and yet the benefit that we have from our perspective today, looking back, is that we can see God at work in the lives of people, trying to bring them forward to a point in time that he could bring the gospel forward. Galatians 4:4. And that we would then be able to benefit from that. So I want these people to get to a point to understand the blessings of God and get to the point of where they would be. They looked earnestly for this. The point that they could come to where there would be the revealing of the sons of God. And so now Paul's saying, you look back at what God did through you. He brought you along, especially those who were of the people. He brought you along to this point in time. He gave you a Messiah. You crucified him, but then because of that, that was God's intent, and he's brought about the gospel through his son, the blood of his son. And now so we see what's happened. You now have the ability to be adopted. You're now sons of God. And you can see humanity, as it were, through all those years earnestly yearning to see the sons of God, for it to come to pass. And the creation then eagerly awaits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility. The problem that we had, sin. Sin is a problem that is evident throughout the Old Testament. It's also addressed in great detail in the New Testament, but there's a difference in the New Testament because we have an answer for sin. Can you imagine living under the law of Moses and in the times past, sin prevalent and the consequences of sin, and no answer for it? And yet now we have an answer for it. So the creation was subject to futility. And so it was subjected. He subjected it in hope. There's hope out there. There's something to hope for. It's going to be better. And so there's a hope that was instilled within them. A hope for a better place. And we talk about some of the people in Hebrews chapter 11 that were moved by faith to do things because they were looking for something better. They were looking for cities that were not made with man's hands. They were looking for dwelling places. They were looking for a citizenship in something better. And so there was always embedded in the futility and the desire for something to change was hope. There's going to be a better day. And this is the hope he's talking about here. It was delivered from the... For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. You have to come to a knowledge of the gospel and an appreciation of it. You've ever seen people in their lives that were just really what we would call dirt poor, and yet they were humble, and something happened and they were suddenly able to enjoy blessings that they never enjoyed before, and yet maintain that humility such that they didn't just go crazy with it and just go out and buy everything that they could see. But they appreciated so much where they were because of where they had been. And that's what we sometimes take for granted. Where we live now, we are basking in the liberty of the gospel. And you look at us today. I like a lot of Old Testament terminology that's used sometimes, where God tells the children of Israel, he said, you're enjoying the bountiful harvest of fields you didn't plant, and you're living in houses you did not build. And it just makes me stop and think of those who've gone before us, who have paved the way for us, who somehow suffered and endured to come to the gospel and held on to it and understood it as a glorious liberty. And if you understand that, you're not going to abandon the gospel. You will never abandon the scriptural teachings of what it takes to become a child of God. That's why it bothers me to no extent when someone says, yeah, we're fixing to go down the road here and, let the elders know somehow, and we're going to start going to some church XYZ because our kids like the people over there or the activities they're doing or, are enticing, and they want to come down there because they enjoy it so much more. You want to shake people like that. I'm sorry, but that's just the way I feel, because you don't understand what you have. And somehow today we've got to understand what we have. The glorious liberty that we have because of the gospel. And we enjoy that today because people who have fought many battles. I go back into my family history, where someone made the decision that they were going to obey the gospel. They were some other religious group. They had some religious affiliation, but they understood what the gospel was. And when they heard it, they came out of error and they stood for the gospel. And I'm a beneficiary of that, and I appreciate that, and I hope you do too. That passage right there is immensely important when you talk about being delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty for the children of God. That is an amazing statement. And we've got to learn to hold on to the gospel and teach the gospel. And we'll suffer for it in probably ways that are not significant, but we'll suffer. We'll suffer alienation. We'll suffer separation from some people. It will be difficult. But the gospel is so important. It is a liberty that we enjoy. The freedom in this country remains for us to enjoy because of those who've given their life. And we need to understand that the liberty of the gospel is the same. Our forefathers were those who held on to the gospel. And I don't mean forefathers of this nation, but the forefathers of the church, of those who suffered and paid the price and maintained the faith to extend down to those of us who would listen to what they had to tell us. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now. You know this experience. Most of you, if you haven't had it personally, you've had it through a sibling or some way. You've been associated with someone going through the process of a pregnancy, who would go through the pains, the discomforts, the denials of being able to eat everything you wanted to. And they went through that. Why? Because the end result was a life that was waited for with great anticipation. And so you think of the pains, the birth pains that you went through, and when you talk to women that have given birth, it's like maybe jokingly they remember some of that, but for the most part, that healthy baby wiped away all of the stuff that they had to go through. Now, think about the gospel coming like that. Anticipation, groanings. When are we going to have that hope, that eternal hope When do we have that we can be a part of? For we know the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs until now. Paul says, you have the gospel. He's already told them it's the power of God to salvation. And now he's given them the details, the anatomy, as it were, of the gospel. That you waited so much for it, that God had already thought about it from the very beginning, that when the time was right, he brought forth the gospel, and he's given it to you, and you need to embrace it. That's where you're going to become sons of God. That's where you're going to be heirs with Christ. But if you're going to be heirs with Christ, you got to understand there's going to be some suffering that goes along with that, but it's nothing compared to the glory that you're going to receive. And so visualize in your mind the idea of through the centuries of time, looking forward to a point of when the gospel would come. What kind of anticipation do you have for that? And now move forward a couple of thousand years, and we're benefiting and we're basking in the glory of the gospel. It's just unbelievable. So we're waiting for that time to come, Paul says. And of course, it has come, but he's saying it's here. Pay attention to it. See how important it is. Verse 23, not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. And Paul talks about some of the things that are going to be beyond this earth and this time frame. And when we talk here about the first fruits, most seem to think that is the idea that when the Spirit came in the beginning of the church and gave them spiritual gifts, they were the first fruits of the Spirit. That they got that initial boost, if as you think about it, of the Spirit actively working within them, the power of God. And yet, even though with that power of God, that wasn't the power of God until salvation. That was just the temporary power of God. And when we look at the conversion of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, they received the Spirit. They just like they did on the first day of the week, on the day of Pentecost. And guess what? When that was done, and they then realized that the Gentiles were acceptable with God, what did Peter say? And now Peter commanded them to be baptized, because that's where we get the implementation of the gospel. And so you have to understand those who had the first fruits, who had the Spirit in their daily lives and the ability to do things, they themselves groaned because they were looking for the adoption. They were looking for the redemption of the body. And our body is going to be redeemed at the last day. This body is going to go away. We're going to be changed. We're going to receive a new body. We're going to be like Him. And they look forward to that. Paul, a number of occasions, looked forward to that. He said, I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I've completed the race. There's a crown of righteousness awaiting for me. That's what I'm looking for. That final redemption. That final salvation. Do we have salvation today? Yes, we do, in a way. But it's not final yet. It's not final. We haven't received it. The glory that's going to come is going to be glory that we can't imagine what it's like.
That we don't have salvation, we have a promise of salvation. And when you don't have something in your hand, you behave differently than when you have it in your pocket. Because you have something to lose. Really, you don't even have it yet. And that kind of gives us that hope. A lot of people don't control their lives based on something they don't yet know that they don't yet have.
Yeah. It's reserved for us.
Yeah.
It's there for us. We've got to finish the race. And that's what we had to understand. Right now, it's a hope for us. And that hope is strong because we believe that it's going to be there. And we can trust God. Paul says, I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded he's able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day. I believe it's there. That's the hope. But obtaining and putting your hands on salvation is not something that we have at this point in time. That's why we hope. And we're going to see that here as we get into this a little bit more. Redemption, we're eagerly awaiting the adoption, for we were saved in this hope. We're in a saved position. That's right, we're in a saved position, holding on to that hope. We don't have it in our hands yet, but it's there. It's there from someone who can be depended on. And he tells us that it's there. We were saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. We don't have it. We don't see it. We can't lay our hands on it. For why does one still hope for what he sees? We don't have it, but we know it's there. And it's promised to us by God, who is faithful and cannot lie. Verse 25, but if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. Perseverance. That means we're going to overcome what comes our way. We like to quote Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. And upon further evaluation of that passage, we look at it from the standpoint, well, if I want to be a great athlete, I can do that. Christ will help me do that. And we think that way. Well, if by Christ helping you do that, it's instilled in you a disciplined mind and you're going to work hard at it, yeah, okay. But the passage better reads, I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the idea is that we have this inheritance, we have this hope, but we have to persevere. It's there for us, and we eagerly await it. It's just like a kid looking toward Christmas, and he's told Santa Claus what he wants, and he told his parents what he wants, and he has great anticipation that he's going to get what he asked for, because it wasn't like $1 million. It was something within reach. And so as the day approaches, how do you think that child reacts to that? Man, I can't wait. Well, how do we look at the hope being fulfilled in sight, being fulfilled in something that we can see? How do we long for that? And he paints a picture here for, we can't see it, but we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. And I know the Christian life, I don't know. I've heard people. It's sometimes it's a matter of your attitude or perspective. Is the Christian life easy? Well, some might say yes. Why? Because you're doing what you know you're supposed to be doing, and you're determined to accomplish what you need to accomplish, no matter the obstacles. And some people will look at that with a positive attitude and say, "No, it's not hard because I know what I'm going to do." That doesn't mean they aren't having difficulties. Then other people may look at it and say, well, that's a tough life because you've got to deny things. You've got to make sure you live a certain way. You're going to live the way God wants you to live. And so, it could be a matter of some person's perspective. But the whole idea is the Christian life has difficulties. And if we're going to receive the hope, that eternal glory that's been promised us, we're going to have to persevere. Persevere. Now, I don't know how you look at it, Uh, God gives us such tremendous blessings on this physical earth that we have. And we have relationships within our family. We have relationships within the family of God. We even have relationships with our friends and neighbors that are a lot of times good. And He's blessed us in so many ways. We aren't on this earth saying, oh, man, I'm ready to go home, to live in glory with God. And, I've got to get, I'm only 50 years old, and I got to go another 25, 30 years, before I can get there. Well, that's not the way we're talking about persevering, just making the time eat up so we get there. We're talking about living every day the way we're supposed to live, overcoming the obstacles that come into our lives with our focus on the glory that's out there somewhere, and enjoying life the way God intended us to do it, not through thrills and entertainment, but through relationships that He's given us upon this earth to make it a joyful place to be. And so as we live day to day, we're going to have to go through the obstacle course. We're going to have people throw things in our way. Satan's always going to be trying to derail us. And we know one day we're not going to be here. But while we're here, we're doing the best that we can to live for God. And that's the thing that we need to look at. Why am I here? Well, God needs you to be here. He needs you to be working. He needs you to be the example that you can be to lead others in the same path that you're trying to go on. And so we walk each day and we persevere. And we know that someday, down life's journey, our life will be over. But that's where we're headed, and we're going to persevere to get there. Likewise, another great understanding of the details, the anatomy of the gospel. Of what does that mean to be a child of God? What does it mean to obey the gospel and live in the gospel? Likewise, the Spirit also helps in our weaknesses. The gospel is the fact that we are given His Spirit, and it bolsters us. It helps us in our weaknesses. It helps us to make the journey. It helps us to overcome the obstacles. For we do not know what we should pray for as we ought. Sometimes we just don't know what to say. That's not that big of a deal. Because the Spirit Himself makes intercessions for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. I'm going through some difficult times right now. I'm having all kinds of problems, and most people don't know about it. I haven't told them, doesn't matter. If you're living according to the gospel, the Spirit is going to be right there with you. And He's going to help you in your weaknesses, and He's going to even help you communicate to God what you need. What a benefit. Now, He who searches the hearts, and who would that be? Who searches the heart? God does. Now, He who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is. He's given Him to you. And He knows what His mind is. And He can communicate with Him. Because He makes intercessions for the saints according to the will of God. Now, we may sometimes pray for things that maybe we shouldn't pray for. God, if you let me have that new job with all those benefits, it's going to be great, Well, maybe something that we don't need to be praying for. But the Spirit whom God reads and is working according to the will of God, is making intercessions for us. So where we're inadequate, he's taking care of that. So God, for the child of God, he has the means in place that he's watching, and he is reading our hearts through the Spirit, and the Spirit's helping to instruct those things that are according to the will of God, and we're there in that communication that is only available to the child of God. Such a wonderful thing that's part of the gospel. We'll stop here, pick back up, and finish up next week. Try our best.